Hello and welcome to Conversations with Catholics. James, welcome back. How you doing?
Yep, I'm doing great. Glad to be back.
I'm really glad to have you, and I'm especially glad to have you today because the format for today's episode is going to be a little bit different than the past few conversations, the past two conversations that we've had.
Mhm.
Do you want to kind of tee up the way that we're going to kind of structure the conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of mentioned this in our very first conversation together that we agree too much, and so so we were trying to figure out, hey, what is a conversation we can have where there's a little bit more back and forth. And it just so happens that I've got a living document. I've been working on it for over 15 years, and it's where my walkthrough on why I am a Catholic and the rationale and the reasoning behind it. And obviously, with you not being Catholic, we're going to get some pushback on it. And I actually did a Reddit post twice. The most recent one had just a small adjustment on one of the points that I had made. But when it was originally posted to Debate an Atheist about almost 3 years ago, before it became what it is now. It had over 70 upvotes, which is my highest rated post on Debate and Atheist. Um, and if that doesn't speak volumes to the quality of the work that's been put into it, I don't know what does. So I'm excited to go into it, dig into it, and just walk you through my process on this. Like I said, it's been something I've been working on honestly since I was like 19 years old.
That's awesome. Um, I'm really looking forward to getting into it and for offering my pushback. Now,
Yes.
what we're going to do is we're going to spend maybe 30 minutes, and that's going to be a very loose 30 minutes, so please don't time us or anything. But just going through this kind of living document. And I'm going to change the screen here so that the audience will be able to read along if they so choose.
Mhm.
Also, the write up is linked in the description down below if anybody in the audience would like to read along on their own or anything like that, or just access this document after the stream is over. Um, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of leave the screen. It's going to be James and it's going to be the write up, and we're going to go through it. And that's going to take however long it's going to take, roughly 30 minutes. And then at the end of that, I'm going to be vociferously taking notes the whole time. Lots of underlines and exclamation points and frowny
Red pen.
faces. Yeah, red pen, exactly. Um, and then I'm just gonna come right out of the bat, just swinging as soon as we're done here. No,
Yes.
it won't be like that, but we will have a dialogue.
Yes.
So with that, James, are you ready for me to kick myself off the screen?
Yep. Absolutely.
All right, here we go.
We've got the YouTube. There we go. We all are. But no, so the motivation behind this, like I said, it started when I was like 18, 19 years old. And it started off as a thought exercise. I had just heard about Descartes and the cogito ergo sum and how he had rejected everything and tried to start at the very beginning. And I was like, you know what? Let me see if I can do that for my faith as well. Like, surely if it's true, I should be able to reject everything and come to that conclusion if it's true. Now, this is something that I will pull up whenever people are like, "So, James, why are you Catholic?" And as you and I kind of discussed before, uh, that is a very different question on why one must be Catholic. So, this is my response to why I am Catholic. It is not designed to convince others, it is just a walkthrough on my faith journey. And so, this is not something I would recommend others to use to convince another individual. It's just my walkthrough. Now, one of the biggest things that I do is I like to use something that is often misconstrued as the Holmesian fallacy. Now, all logical tools are done to help us to knowledge, but just like any tool, they can be misused. And the Holmesian fallacy is when that particular logical tool is misused. As you can see there, that's one of the first write-ups that I've done, is actually explaining what that fallacy is. In a nutshell, if you know what all of the possible outcomes are available and you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains has to be true. That's why it's called the Holmesian fallacy, is because it comes from that famous line of Sherlock Holmes. Within that, though, is a cheat code to be able to actually do the Holmesian logic correctly, and it's through negation. If I say everything is either a potato or not a potato, and I hold something up, and we determine it's not a potato, then we know that it's not a potato. We might not know exactly what it is, but we know that because it doesn't fit in the category of potato, it must fit in the category of not a potato. So with that, clarification as far as like my approach, as far as like taking what we can know, figuring out if the thing itself is true or if its negation is true, and then moving on from there. That's part of the process that I go through. And starting at the very beginning is the very question of, is there a God or is there not a God? Now, in there, I point to atheistic religions, because to me, a religion is a way one lives their life. Now, when I say an atheistic religion, I'm not saying that atheism itself is a religion. I'm talking about things like Buddhism, where there isn't a God, but there is a philosophy and religious approach to a way of life. And the way that I define or understand God at this point in the conversation is just quite simply something that is the source or cause of that which exists or is in reality. Now, at this point, I do accept the possibility of a god being created by another god, like Greek pantheons, where Zeus was created by pre-existing gods that created him, but he himself is a god. And within that, I then go through, well, does there exist at least a god or not? And I go through a conversation or a thought process between contingent or necessary beings. A point of clarification. In philosophy, a being is just simply something that exists. Because rocks are beings, the phone's a being, it's just something that is existing. And there's two types of beings: things that are contingent or dependent on something else, and things that aren't a necessary being. And from observations, we can see that there are things that are dependent on something else in order to exist. So therefore, there exist contingent beings. Through logic, we know that an infinite regress doesn't exist. It's actually called it is a fallacy, and there's a term for it. I believe it's called the name's escaping me, but you can't have something infinitely going back like an infinite chain of dominoes where each domino is the cause of the preceding domino, as there isn't a grounding point. The other aspect of it is you can't have a circular or cyclical argument, because that just goes right back into the infinite regress. So therefore, there must be something that itself is not dependent on anything else in order for it to exist. Some of the common objections, which I do touch on a little bit, but we'll skip for this part. I'll leave Kevin to actually bring this up if he so chooses. Is, contingent beings don't actually exist, or infinite regresses are indeed possible. The only thing that I will kind of touch on is, when I say an infinite regress, I am not talking about infinity itself can't exist. An infinite, eternal world can still exist, yet still require a necessary being. It's the regression itself that is fallacious. So at this point, one can conclude that there must be at least one necessary being. So now this next point is, well, is there only one, or is there more than one God? Now, from there, we have to determine, okay, so we know that there's contingent and non-contingent beings. There's also within that category what's called composite, or a being that is made up of parts. Because something is made up of parts and each of those individual parts must exist separately of what it makes up. So, for example, I am a human being. I have hair, eyes, skin, all of these different things that make up me being a human being. But my hair exists on its own. My eye exists on its own. So that's what it's mean by it being composite. And because each of those parts must exist on their own, and a part of me existing is the fact that I exist. I possess the quality or trait of existing, just like how I have brown hair, so therefore brown must exist. Maybe not on its own separately from me, as in you're not going to find brown as its own. It's always going to be attached to something else, but that doesn't mean that brown itself doesn't exist. So I have existence as a trait. So existence must have its own essence. And the essence of existence is existence. You know, you when you look at what existence is, it is itself through the law of identity. Now, this is not an argument for the Platonic forms or anything else like that. The best modern day equivalent that I can bring up to what an essence is what we would call an accident. Now, or not an accident, a definition. That which makes something what it is a definition in our modern understanding. From there, now that we have a little bit of a better idea on what this necessary being is, where it's pure existence, just nothing else. As the source of all that exists, it itself is existence. If there is more than one thing, so like there's more than one human being, what differentiates me from Kevin is what Aristotle would call the 10 categories. Easiest one is position, location. So where I am is different than where Kevin is, even if we have the same essence. Therefore, it's two distinct separate essences. For this necessary being that is existence, only existence, there is no separating categories for it because it's just is. It's everywhere. It's omnipresent. So there isn't a differentiating way of location. There isn't a way to differentiate one existence with no other qualities with a different existence, no other qualities. So there can only be one existence qua existence. Now, as you can tell, I have a lot of different links and posts, and this part is where we're going to be moving away from what I call the hard logic, where it leads to one singular conclusion that must be true. And if this conclusion isn't true, then something's wrong with either the logic or understanding. But to me, this is as ironclad as to say 2 + 2 = 4. We're moving more into what is reasonable. We might not know it to be true with 100% certainty, but this at least is a little bit more, this is the reasonable approach. This is the one that there's still wiggle room. One can make an argument of a flaw here or there. but out of the available evidence available to us, to me, this is the most rational position one can have starting at this point in the conversation. Everything else I feel like is pretty ironclad. This part is a little bit more what I like to call historical facts, where based on the available evidence, we believe that there was a Battle of Thermopylae. If we get evidence that proves us otherwise, then now we need to make a new position. But based on the available evidence, we do believe there was a Battle of Thermopylae. So out of all of that, which religion do we follow? Because if there was a singular being that is pure essence, this is either a deistic being or a theistic being. Now, a deistic being wouldn't interact with reality other than just being the source of it. We wouldn't be able to tell that it exists or that it doesn't exist based on it interacting with us or not. Whereas a theistic being does interact. So if there is a theistic being, we would see evidence of it existing in our history. So is there a religion out there that claimed to have an interaction with this being? And is there a religion out there that follows existence qua existence? And in my studies of ancient religions, three stand out to me. Zoroastrianism. There was a period in Egypt's history where they only worshipped Aten, and then obviously the Abrahamic religions. Now, starting with Egypt, this fails upon immediate inspection because they didn't claim that Aten was existence qua existence. They did claim that it was the source of all that exists, yes, but they believed it was literally the sun, not a god in the appearance of the sun, or the sun symbolized this, or like with the Greeks where the sun was the chariot of Apollo. No, the sun itself, that physical thing, was Aten. And so because that's not existence qua existence. In Zoroastrianism, it's a lot closer. It's a lot more tricky. In there, it's very much what I like to call a yin-yang. They believed in two deities, one that was pure evil and one that was pure good. And on a surface level, it sounds very similar to the way that some Christian faiths will talk about their God that they worship, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But the reason why this fails is because that's not existence qua existence, that's existence plus goodness. So while it is closer, it's not the same thing as existence qua existence. The one thing that stunned me, that stuck with me, is in the book of Exodus. You have the Jewish people claiming that God identified himself by name, and in that culture and in that tradition, the name of a god revealed its essence, what it is. God here revealed himself as I am who am. I am. Which is the first person present participle, if I'm remembering my English terminology correctly. First person participle of the verb being or to be. God identified himself as being, the act of existence. He is just existence itself. Now, as you'll see in the post there, I do state that this isn't definitive. Like I said, we're moving away from definitive, like, oh, it has to be this way, to like, here's a strong case for it being this situation. Now, could one argue that the Jewish people reasoned to this the same way that I did? I find it highly unlikely based on a lot of geopolitical situations that were going on and everything else that I go into a little bit more detail within the text itself. I find it unlikely, not impossible, just unlikely. So now that we've, though, have concluded that, at least I've concluded, the Abrahamic religion out of those three is the most likely one to have had this interaction with essence qua or existence qua existence. which of the three Abrahamic religions is the correct one? Islam, Judaism, or Christianity? Within Judaism, with it being the oldest and the one that does have that direct claim, they believed in the coming of a Messiah. Now, I know people will talk about nowadays, well, they don't really believe that or anything else, but at the time of the original text, there was this belief of Messiah. In fact, during the time of Jesus was the time that the Messiah was supposed to have arrived. Jesus wasn't the only one to claim to being a Messiah. In fact, Barabbas claimed to be a Messiah as well. Now, what makes Jesus's claims of being the Messiah unique is his claims of divinity as well. Now, I know there are some people out there who will claim Jesus is just a myth. There is a link in there done by someone who is an atheist but understands historical evidence a lot better than I could, that presents why the Jesus myth theory is not accepted within academic circles. So Jesus did exist, and there were followers of his who made several claims. Whether Jesus made these claims or not, I think is a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm interested in at this time, because the followers are the ones that made that claim, which is he claimed to be divine, he died and rose again. And then the apostles suffered hardships from this. And then I present the famous, liar, lunatic, Lord theory in some variation, but it's being applied to the apostles instead of directly to Jesus. And while there are individuals who have expressed criticism, again, Kevin, you and I can get into that a little bit more, but to me, one of the strongest pieces of evidence for this argument is the Nixon tapes, where there was this conspiracy in the government, and it was a very small group of individuals, and the stakes were pretty high for them to keep it secret. They weren't able to keep it secret. So if death wasn't on the line, just, career death, so to speak, but not actual literal death, and they couldn't keep that a secret, how could these 12 men keep it a secret or lie or a conspiracy as well? So the idea that they were lying doesn't make sense to me. People who are insane don't go down in history. So I don't see a movement, and we have a lot of large movements led by people who are insane that have fallen away. So to me, the most rational conclusion from this is that the apostles were telling the truth. And then for Islam, they deny the historical account of the cross, because you can't be a prophet of God and have died on a tree. Like, that was the highest of dishonor. So if they deny something that happened historically, and the resurrection, which seems to be the most likely scenario for the apostles' willingness to accept their persecutions, it doesn't seem to me likely that Islam is capturing that fullness of truth. Now, as far as which denomination within Christianity, why Catholicism out of all of the others, is quite simply because the apostles were promised by Christ that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church that he founds with them, that he will be with them throughout all of time and ensure that they are guided to all of truth. Well, from the founding of the apostles all the way up until the Protestant Reformation, there was only the Catholic Church. Yes, there were heresies. Yes, there were people arguing and debating on what the actual truth was, but there was still only the one church. And from there, the whole Protestant argument hinges on whether or not Jesus kept his promise. And if Jesus didn't keep his promise, then he's a liar. He's not God. And we're in much bigger trouble than we thought. Or Jesus did keep his promise. It is the Catholic Church. And even with the messes that the church has gone through, he's still there guiding it to truth. And that is a very brief rundown. Like, as y'all saw as we were going through it, there were quotes and passages and everything else. And as far as the in-depth aspect, you can look into it. And I'm always open to DMs even after this stream is done for questions, comments, and concerns regarding the post after today.
Awesome, James. That was great. Thank you so much for running us all through that. I couldn't find my red pen, so I used a red. But my Post-it note is red that I was, or not, whatever you call this thing. So, the spirit of red is, and I'm wearing a red shirt in honor to representing how irate and angry I am right now. So I do hope that my fury shows through in the rest of today's conversation.
Yes.
Okay. So, a little bit more seriously though, I did go ahead and jot down notes as you were talking, and I, truthfully, I kind of had notes up here because this isn't the first time that I've read it. So I know that you even kind of alluded to some of the questions that I'm going to ask. But I guess a question for you: do you want to? So I could ask questions in the same order that you read in, or I could go in the opposite order, starting with the.
You can jump around as much as you want.
Okay. Guess what? I guess we'll start at the beginning. So, one place that I would love to start with you is, and so starting at the beginning, which means that we haven't gotten to God yet.
Right.
So you were talking about necessary and contingent beings, and you rightly pointed out this is something that Kevin and I are going to disagree on. So as I think that we've spoken about before, I don't think that contingent things exist. And you said something that really stuck out to me, and this is the first thing that I would love for us to dwell on for a minute.
Yeah.
You said something like this: through observation, we know that contingent things exist. And I don't think that's an exact quote, but it's something close. I definitely heard through observation.
Yeah.
And whenever I hear through observation, my ears I get really excited. The empiricist in me is all happy. But I would like to push back on the idea that we observe contingent things.
Yeah.
Physicists do not use terms like necessary and contingent things.
Right.
That's just not part of the scientific landscape. And in fact, I think that there is a unstated, because they just don't talk about existence in essence, but I think that there's an unstated monism about existence in all of the hard sciences. So that is to say, there is no question about whether or not a certain electron will jump from one valence shell to another valence shell when blasted with a certain amount of energy, right? It either will or it won't, based on the amount of energy that the electron is given, and that's kind of that. So that is to say, that electron is necessarily where it must be, right? Likewise, everything else in the universe is exactly where it must be.
Yep.
And for this reason, I think that everything, if you're going to use, and again, I don't think that science really uses this kind of philosophical language, but if I was going to, I would argue that everything is necessary. Nothing contingent actually exists. So yeah, what do you think about all that?
So something can be both necessary and contingent. I did get a notification that my internet connection is unstable. To repeat, let me know. But
I heard you so far.
Something can be both contingent and necessary. What do I mean by that? So, Kevin, you exist right now, right? By the very fact that you exist, I know necessarily there must have been a male and a female involved in you existing. But the reason why your mother exists is because of the same thing. So she's contingent on that relation, but she's also necessary for your existence. The reason why science doesn't use contingent necessary language the way that the philosopher does has to do with something that I learned about, I want to say it was the Inuit. But anyways, like the people that live in the snow, like all they know is the snow. So they have a multitude of words to describe the different types of snow, because if all you know is the snow, you're going to notice differences between hard packed, iced over snow, fluffy snow. Like you're going to have all of these different terms for it because you're going to notice it. Science in the observation of the physical, which by definition has to be contingent by the philosophical understanding of contingent necessary, they're not going to talk about that difference between a contingent and a necessary thing, but they're going to have all of these different words and all of these different terms for the different types of being that they do observe, all of which exist within that category of contingent. So when I'm saying a contingent being, the way that I like to simplify it is, in order for Kevin to exist today, there had to have been something else that happened prior to Kevin existing. It wasn't the case that Kevin decided, you know what, today I feel like I'm going to exist, and then comes into existence. You were dependent on something outside of your control in order for you to exist. The confusion that comes into play is the question of, I believe, determinism. Something can be contingent yet still deterministic. So the existence of the fact that, no, the reason why Kevin and James is having this conversation right now, it had to have happened this way. It is impossible, and there's no other way it could have been, which gets into the multiverse and possible world argument, which I don't make, and I feel like falls into the very same trap you were talking to for that reason. But even if this is the only world that can exist because it has to be this way, I'm still dependent on my parents in order for me to exist. I'm still dependent on the Earth's gravity to keep my muscles and sinews and everything else the way it's supposed to be. Like, I'm still dependent on all of these different things in order for me to be. I am not in control of my existence. I am dependent on so many outlying factors, whereas a necessary being is in full control of its existence. It is not dependent on any outside factors. It just is.
Yeah, so if you don't mind me pushing back a little bit on the example. So you said something to the effect of, like, Kevin is a contingent being because Kevin relies on things that come before him. So I don't think, and I think that the majority of philosophers would be with me on this one, that relying on things that come before you is not actually a sufficient reason that we would call something contingent. Example, imagine that God created a universe in which there was just one particle that's going to move in a straight line and hit another particle that's going to move in a straight line until it hits another particle, which will then move in a straight line until it hits a fourth particle. Okay. Right. So now at this point in time, this fourth particle is moving. That fourth particle is only moving because of the third particle hitting it, which is in turn only moving. But all of those things are necessary. They couldn't have happened any other way. So it's not true that the fourth particle could have been moving in any other way. No. In this supposed universe, things had to happen only one way, and indeed they did only happen in one way. So because of that, it's a necessary outcome. It's not, there was nothing contingent about the movement of that fourth particle, and that's how I think that our universe is too.
Yeah. So, and that goes into what I was talking about, the the muddling of the waters, because yes, a lot of people will use the contingent and necessary when talking about the multi-world or the best possible world theory, and that's not what I'm doing here. So while it is necessary for that fourth particle, because of the way that it was all set up and everything else, because it has to come about that that fourth particle moved, yes, you're absolutely right. It has to move that way. However, could that particle move on its own? Could that particle have moved without the third one? No, it was requiring that. So, in at least the way that I'm using it here, and the way that the philosophers that I've studied, as far as like that use the language that I'm using, that's what they're talking about. It doesn't matter that because of the way that it was arranged up, that the fourth particle must move. It matters that the particle can't move itself. So a contingent being requires something else to move it. Doesn't matter if it has to move or not. It just, something had to move it. Whereas a necessary being moves itself. It is, like to get into like the ridiculous physics and whatnot, the let's say a perpetual motion machine, does exist. It must move. Nothing's going to stop it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a perpetual motion machine. It must keep moving. So one could say it necessarily has to move. But if you look at every theoretical idea for a perpetual motion machine, it doesn't start moving itself. Something puts motion into it, and then it perpetuates that motion. It's the same thing here, or at least the question that I'm trying to answer is, can a perpetual motion machine exist that created its own motion, or did it get its motion elsewhere? And then when you take that and apply it to existence, that's the difference between necessary and contingent.
I think that this is probably where the disconnect is happening. So I've commonly understood the definition of a contingent thing is a thing that could have been otherwise.
Yeah, and that is how it's defined when you're doing the best possible worlds argument. But when you look into, and this is one of the reasons why I was so proud of this work, I think you and I have touched on briefly that Aquinas' 5 ways are not how he tries to prove the existence of God. It's actually in this book on Being in Essence. Now, from the looks of it, it's a pretty thick book. You can find a PDF, and I actually link a free PDF that's like 20 pages. Almost all of it is Joseph Bobick's commentary. In fact, like he spends 20 pages just on the first 2 paragraphs of Aquinas. But the reason why I was so proud is because I actually came up with a very similar argument to what Aquinas does here, as far as like the essence of God. But the idea, or the very first argument for a necessary being came from Al-Ghazali, an Islamic thinker. And in it, he's not even talking about best possible worlds or it could have been this way, but it was different. While contingent is often used to mean that, it could have been one way, but was another. It has more to do and is more properly understood as dependent on or isn't its own reason for what's being observed or questioned.
So, would your understanding of contingent state that even in a purely deterministic universe, there are plenty of contingent things?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess in that case, I'm fine then with your definition of contingent. But I guess if the definition of contingent that you're using is such that it's fine in like things that couldn't have been otherwise can still be called contingent.
Yep.
How are we using that then, I guess, to argue to some kind of how are we using that to get to some kind of God? Because sorry, go ahead.
So I'm going to use motion again. It's not a perfect analogy when you get into the nitty gritty, but I think it's about the closest to a perfect analogy we're ever going to get. I know a lot of people, when they try to talk about, an eternal world or something like that, as a common counter to the need for a God, they'll use an infinite chain of dominoes. And this gets into why the need for this understanding of the contingent necessary that we just went over is important. But you have an infinite chain of dominoes. And domino 50 falls over because domino 49 push it over, because domino 48, that, 4-particle example we were using. But let's just say it's infinite, all right? Well, like I said, an infinite regress is fallacious. It's homunculum fallacy is the name of it. You can't just keep saying, well, why did 49 fall? Well, because of 48. Well, why did 48 fall? Because of 47. You can't. That's fallacious thinking. And I know people will try to say, oh, but, what if reality works differently? Unfortunately, that's special pleading. As of right now, based on everything that we understand, there must be, an infinite regress cannot happen in reality to our understanding. In fact, I had someone try to argue with me and said, no, we don't understand the Big Bang to happen the way that you described it. Here it is. And he presented a paper that actually described it exactly the way that I explained it, and even ended with and even if we're in expansion number 57, and then we go back and we see, oh, here's expansion 58. There's got to be a first singularity before all of this expanding in itself. So you have an infinite domino chain. And because each domino can't be the cause of its own motion, its own act of falling. And I've got the chat on my iPhone so I can follow along. So, Will, I'm going to get to your question here. Because each individual domino can't be its own reason for falling, we now have to ask, how did motion get introduced to this equation going into that perpetual motion machine that I was talking about? Like every perpetual motion theory that you look at that tries to argue for it, how do they all start? Motion being introduced to it. So you have an infinite chain of causes and effects, which a perpetual motion machine is. There still needs to be motion introduced into it. You can't get to 1 if all you're adding is a bunch of zeros. And if each domino equals 0, where did the 1 come from? That's the necessary being. Whatever 1 is.
Cool. And for the record, I actually am one of those people who thinks that there probably was a starting point to the universe, as it were. And I'm pretty cool with people saying that's
whatever that is.
All that I'm saying, yeah. And I'm kind of cool. Power to you, man.
Yeah.
Now, that to say, as long as we're kind of cool with determinism being true, then I'm on board. And if people want to say that contingent things are things that could have been otherwise, I say, oh, well, I actually don't think that anything could be other than the way that it is. But there are challenges to determinism. And quantum indeterminacy is something that comes up a lot. So I did want to make sure that I addressed this question before we stray too far from the topic. And so I actually do think that if we were quantum beings, then this would be a really good reason for us to actually think that determinism was false. But here's the thing. Something funny happens as soon as you rise up to the atomic level, where all of a sudden everything is deterministic. And so I have a suspicion that what is happening at quantum levels is deterministic in some way, and it's actually not indeterministic anyway. It's probabilistic, which isn't the same thing as indeterministic. It's similar though. And so I don't think that gesturing towards quantum indeterminacy is a really good reason for rejecting determinism, because I think that the evidence of determinism is overwhelming, and it's only the area that we know the least about, like the newest area of physics that we're like, ooh, maybe this is, you know what I mean? And I don't know, maybe I'm just kind of not super confident in the findings of anything quantum related. But even if I was confident in them, then something spooky happens as soon as we move from the quantum level to the atomic level.
Yeah.
And at the atomic level, everything is deterministic.
Yeah.
So that's why I don't think that quantum indeterminacy, so called.
Yeah, and that gets into free will, which is beyond the scope of what I'm looking at. But that might be a conversation for another day. I know you and I teased the idea of potentially a free will conversation.
We did, yeah.
I did want to touch on Will because he had a two-parter question.
Yes, sorry.
So he was like, I wondered why this is fallacious in regards to like the infinite regress. Where is the contradiction? Just because something is fallacious doesn't mean that there is a contradiction. It means there is a flaw in logic. To touch on something that you and I talked on earlier about the Holmesian fallacy. Let's say I sit down with you and I say, all right, Kevin, you are either going to feed your cat after dinner or you're going to feed your cat after this podcast. Well, you decide that you fed your cat before dinner. Well, that's the Holmesian fallacy because I didn't account for that possibility. But if I said, so that there's no contradiction there.
Yeah.
It's a flaw in our logical reasoning. The proper way to have presented that would have been, Kevin, you're either going to feed your cat after dinner or not.
Yeah, no,
so,
well said. Yeah. Also, if I just said like premise 1, roses are red. Premise 2, violets are blue. Conclusion, there is no God. God is dead, right? Okay. Where's the contradiction? Well, there is none. It's just a non sequitur. It's just a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. Like,
yep.
So yeah. Well said. I think we're current on questions. There's one more thing that I wouldn't mind dwelling on for a minute before we get more specific than just kind of God. So, and actually, let me just kind of summarize. So, I'm with you on there was a start to, like, there was a starting point.
Yeah.
But here's another kind of challenge that I have for you. So, you used the color brown as an example. You said that brown exists, but just not on its own. I'm one of those like really annoying people who thinks that brown doesn't actually exist. And I'm being very pedantic when I say this because like clearly like, you know, I can look
the appearance of brownness is out
right
there.
Like I see it right now. Like I'm actually looking, I have like a shelf and it's a brown shelf and it's right here and I see it. So like what do I mean brown doesn't exist?
Yeah.
Here's what I actually mean. The experience of brownness is a brain state that is caused by light of a certain spectrum hitting my eye, right?
Yeah. I'm right there with you on that.
Yeah, and I do think that photons exist. And I do think that photons within, I forgot what the wavelength of brown is, but I do think that photons exist at a certain wavelength that we interpret as brown, for sure. Like I'm on board. But I don't think that brown exists as this kind of substance, either in Plato's realm or that inheres in objects, but not on its own, you know? So I don't think that either of those two things are true. I think that what is true is that there are photons and photons have wavelengths and stuff like that. So that doesn't actually matter too much to the main point that you were making. I just kind of wanted to throw that challenge out there because...
Just be like, hey, James, even though you're right here, you're wrong on this little thing, but that's irrelevant. I just wanted you to know you're wrong.
But then I'm gonna claim total victory because of a spelling mistake that you made or something like that. No, but here's what I will say actually is that I do think that a lot of Catholics will use the kind of Thomistic general framework, the moderate realism of Aquinas, right? And Aristotle. They'll use moderate realism as like a model for understanding the world, and I don't think that moderate realism is actually a really good model for understanding the world.
So what I will say is Aquinas was neither Aristotle nor Plato. Granted, he pulled a lot from Aristotle. There's no denying that. So, but because of that, it is very easy to read him as, like you said, the moderate realism. From my studies, I don't think that's what he was. That's why it said even there, like the way that he and I would understand it is very closer to our modern day of definitions. So like, as you were saying, well, brown doesn't exist. It is a photon of a certain wavelength, blah, 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 blah. Aquinas and I would just look at you and say, yeah, that's the essence of brownness, that photon of a particular wavelength, blah, 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 blah. So essence itself is a descriptor of what a thing is. The way that it was explained to me in my studies was Aristotle and Plato were both struggling with the question of why do things exist? And they couldn't separate existence and essence. Like, Kevin, you exist because there is this platonic form of human that is giving you humanness. It would be Plato. Whereas Aristotle was like, no. Kevin, you exist because you're human, which points to the pinnacle of what it means to be human, but you're trying to get there, but you exist because you're human. Like, you being human is tied to your existence, whereas Aquinas would come in and say, hold on, I can think of Kevin, but the thing that I have of Kevin is not the Kevin that's in front of me. So therefore, the essence of what it means to be Kevin, because if the essence is what makes something exist, then because I am conceiving of that essence of Kevin, that means that there's a real Kevin in my brain, but clearly that's not the case. So he was able to separate this idea of the essence and existence. And because of that, you now get to that's why I say, like, to Aquinas and myself, the essence is just the definition of the thing. It's what makes human be human and not dog. And I know people will argue on, like, well, essences don't exist, et cetera, et cetera. But if that was the case, then we wouldn't be able to differentiate anything.
So I strongly disagree here.
Yeah. When the way that Aquinas and myself understand essence is just, it's our ability to point at a thing and say, well, because of this, and this, it belongs in this category. And because it doesn't have these attributes, it doesn't belong in another category.
Yeah. So maybe I should ask a clarifying question before I kind of jump in here. If I said essences don't exist, would you be cool with going like, yeah, kinda?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like,
so
like in the same way that a set of even numbers doesn't exist. It's just a grouping, a way for us to group things that do exist.
Are you cool with this? Essences are just a I'm trying to phrase this correctly. Because this is something, essences, comma, like definitions, comma, are useful labels that humans can use when talking about things to try to express ideas more easily.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm totally cool with that. I consider that to be nominalism. So I consider that to be like, so we don't think that essences actually exist. We just think that it's a figure of speech whereby, like, we use them because it's so much easier for me just to say red rather than, the brain state that occurs when a photon that is, that has a certain wavelength.
Hexadecimal.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. No, red. Oh, please. That's why we have definitions. Yeah. And if our view of essence is, it's just a definition, man, don't think too hard about it. Then I'm actually on board, and I think that's cool.
Yeah. Which is why Jimmy says you can be anomalous and believe in the true presence.
Well, hey, yeah. And that is actually a really interesting thing, because I think it does require you to reject transubstantiation, just not the real presence, because I think that the real presence is a wider tent than transubstantiation. Does that make sense? Like,
you and I have touched on it, and I think I get where you're coming from, and maybe that's now we've got two possible.
That's fair. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm happy to kind of bookmark the first part and then move to this.
Mhm.
Only if you are though. I
Yeah.
want to make sure. Okay, let me just look at the chat
Actually,
real
real quick,
quick.
because Will,
Yeah.
I do want to touch on Will because it's still on the
Yes.
whole thing. So the difference between a single particle traveling for all time and an infinite chain of dominoes falling is because honestly, like there is no difference, so to speak. I think the difference is coming from so that photon is traveling from all time, you know, but it started moving because of the Big Bang, that first expansion of matter, that first explosion when space and time started. So that movement or that growth caused that photon to be moving, but it hasn't interacted with anything else and will never interact with anything else to transfer that motion. Whereas with the chain of dominoes, you're seeing it almost immediately. So the infinite regress, the reason why it's so appealing, I think, is because, and I mean no insult to anyone who wants to do it, but it really is, it's lazy acceptance in the sense of like, okay, well, why did domino A move? Well, because the preceding domino moved it, and you just repeat that. Oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. Whereas it's like, well, no, that doesn't make sense. Like, why? Like, where did the motion itself come into in the first place? It's not asking the in the first place question. And I think what helps is cause and effect. And Bishop Barron actually, I think, put it simply in one of his AMAs on Reddit. And if I can remember it, but he basically said, the law of cause and effect is an answer to the why question. And even if we don't know the answer, there must be a why, an answer to that why question. And an infinite regress never answers it.
And then Will did put one more comment in there. I don't know if you want to take that or because I've got plenty of my own questions for you too. So.
I mean, you and I kind of touched on this a little bit. It's like, I am not a subscriber of the best possible worlds argument. I don't like that argument. But, you know, intellectually, it is possible for such a universe to exist. But it would still require that photon, like, a photon has to move. And there would still have required something to have given it that motion, that energy. Otherwise, it becomes motion qua motion, to use the terminology from before.
Photon might be a bad example for this. I know what you're talking about, but
yeah,
photons actually, they're not moving because something imbued them with energy. You know what I mean? Like photons all move at the same speed all the time. So it's a photon isn't like, you know, if you hit a photon with more energy, it's going to move faster.
Actually,
the wavelength will be different, but the speed will be the same.
Well, no. Have you ever heard of what happens in nuclear reactors? There's a blue light that occurs. Have you heard about this blue light?
Is it like a phase shift or something like that?
I don't think a phase shift is the right thing, but that light, and I wish I remembered the name of it, but that light occurs because the radiation is happening faster than the speed of light in water.
Okay.
So photons, the speed of light, that photon, doesn't change in relation to itself. But depending on the matter it's moving through, exactly, like because of the matter it's moving through, it can change to the observer, to us. So, and we've even slowed a photon down to be able to capture it in a picture through like ridiculous use of nitroglycerin and stuff like they cooled the air down so intently that they were actually able to capture a light photon on camera.
Is that like possible in principle?
No, they've done it. Slow-mo guys did it, or interviewed someone, the facility that did it.
You're breaking up a little bit, James. I can hear you, but like
I think because I'm looking up. Yeah, the slow-mo guys filming the speed of light at 10 trillion frames per second is the name of the video.
I guess I'm just not sure how we could, in principle, capture a picture of a photon, because like the way that I'm imagining like a picture of a photon would have to be representative to a large degree, because we can't, like, photons are what we use to take pictures. So how do we get a picture of a photon?
Yeah, you know I like, and I get you, like, they get, like, it's been a while since I've watched the video, but it was just like with you talking about the whole, like, it's the same speed in reference to itself. Yes. In reference to itself, as I understand it, yes.
Well, all
but in reference,
all photons have the same speed with reference to us too. Photons are traveling at the literal speed limit of the universe, which is really interesting.
Right. Well, that's what I was getting at. Is like, if that was true, then we couldn't have slowed it down. Like they literally slowed it down.
You can't slow a photon. Photons will always travel at the speed of light all the time,
which varies depending on the medium that it's traveling.
The speed of light doesn't actually change ever. However, a photon will bounce. So what's the speed of light in a solid lead wall? Imagine a foot thick of lead. What's the speed of light in that medium? Well, technically it's unchanged. It's the speed of light. It's just that most of the photons are going to bounce off the lead. Now, what's the speed of light in water? It's still the speed of light. The speed of light doesn't change. However, a lot of photons will pass through water. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Yeah. And so when we're talking about the speed of light in mediums, the speed of light is the speed of light and it doesn't change. But what we're talking about is the percentage of photons that will pass through the medium and in what amount of time. Because photons are going to go in and they're going to bounce around like pinballs or something like that before they come out the other side. So that's obviously, like, if you're just measuring how long does it take you to get from here to here, then sure, the medium does impact it. But yeah, anyway, we're getting like really off into the weeds here.
Yeah, I mean, and I can send you a link because everything that I've read, the speed of light is always quantified as in a vacuum. And I'm seeing, like, is the speed of light constant? Like, something that I'm saying is light is slowed down in transparent media such as air, water, and glass. The ratio by which it is slowed is called the refractive index of the medium and is always greater than 1, which was discovered by Jean Foucault in 1850. If
you looked at any individual photon, that photon is always going to be traveling at the speed of light. But in a medium, the path of a photon is going to be going like this.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry. In a vacuum, like I was saying, it's going to be the straight line. But in a medium, the path won't be a straight line. The path will be something like this as it bounces. Then it passes through.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and like I was saying, like, relative to itself, it's the same. To us, varies and is the language I've always heard it used. And that very well might be a case of just inaccurate language.
Yeah. Yes, it gets weird. But I think that the thesis of your write-up is more or less unimpacted by the speed of light. So yes. I think we can safely kind of, put a bookmark here and cool. Okay. If it's cool with you, I'll jump into the second section where, hey, we've got to the universe has a cause, but we haven't even gotten past deism and theism yet. So that's kind of where my next question comes in. So, you said something like deism cannot be proven, but theism can be. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. The and you know, some people sometimes they'll get mad at me and they'll say, Kevin, like you say that you're an agnostic, but you're really just a cowardly atheist. And I'll say something like, I don't think so. Because
They're grabbing that from C.S. Lewis, I believe, but
okay, I actually didn't know that. But
yeah, like I think it was Mere Christianity that he touched on that, but it was like the agnostic, like he is quoted to have said, the agnostic wants to appreciate the beauty like the theist, but with the freedom of the atheist, or something like that.
Okay, I mean, I have a bone to pick with C.S. Lewis. No, but the reason I you know, I'm pretty adamant about not calling myself an atheist is because of kind of because of deism. Like, if deism were true, like in principle, I don't think that we have a way of knowing, and because of that, like that's enough for me just to say no. I really don't think that I can call myself an atheist, right?
Yeah.
Because like I don't think you could in principle know if deism was true or false. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like you can reason to. I would say like you can reason yourself to deism being true, but you can't argue whether it's false because you have no way of.
Deism could be as basic as saying like there are some people who want to kind of say like, well, just God is the sum total of all things, and like if that's how we're defining God,
yeah,
then like okay,
that's unsatisfactory though.
Yes. But that is enough for me to say, like, okay, then I'm not going to call myself an atheist then. So that was a long-winded way of saying I agree with that point that you made. Wanted to start on a point of agreement. But then you quickly moved into another area where you said something to the effect of, okay, so you were talking about Aten, and you said something to the effect of, like, Aten isn't super viable because there was never a claim that Aten was like existence qua existence, but
right,
like Yahweh, there was this claim because Yahweh said I am who am and all that. And I wouldn't mind pushing back on this for a second because I think that the Old Testament, and let me even be more specific, I think that the God that is written about in like the books of like Genesis and Exodus, for instance, is very, very different than the God of the philosophers, right? I was actually just reading Genesis this morning, and and so I was. This is in Genesis chapter 3. So Eve, so the serpent walks up to Eve, right? Because the serpent has legs and walks up to Eve. Hey, you know, God was actually Yahweh was lying to you, right? You should eat this fruit. He's afraid that you're going to become like him. So Eve eats it. She gives it to Adam. Adam eats it, and then there's this really interesting passage where it says, God was walking in the garden, and Adam heard God walking, and he hid. Yeah. And God is like, where are you, Adam? And Adam's like, I'm hiding from you, God, because you're scary. And I don't know. I just the way that God is written about, and I should be specific too, the way that Yahweh is written about, right? In Genesis, just doesn't seem to be somebody whose existence is whose essence is existence and all that, you know?
Yeah. So this gets into, I think, one of the best explanations as far as the language used in the Bible, especially when people are like, well, how do you know when it's allegorical, metaphorical, literal, not literal, like all of this? The Bible uses language of appearance. So when the Bible talks about like, and God appeared, like literally we'll say, appeared as a pillar of fire. Well, he's not literally a pillar of fire, but that's the appearance of it. Have you read anything by H.P. Lovecraft?
Yes, I'm a huge Lovecraft fan.
Okay.
I literally have a tattoo of a Shoggoth from At the Mountains of Madness.
Nice.
Like that. Nice. I'm not going to be able to show it to you, but it's like right here is where it is.
Nice. So you'll appreciate this then. H.P. Lovecraft is 100% accurate in a human being's response to something as infinitely vast as Yahweh.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So you have these finite human beings, assuming that they had this experience, experiencing something they can't explain and trying to figure out how to explain it to people. Now this gets into and maybe this is the wrong way for me to approach it, but to me, I don't see a whole lot of difference between this and science's approach to it, where if I came up to you, Kevin, and I said, I've got video evidence, or I'm able to show you a perpetual motion machine, the first thing you're going to ask me is, where'd you hide the battery? Because according to the laws of physics, that's impossible. It's not a question of maybe we can twist it this way or that way, or no, there's no way. It is impossible. So because I have arrived at the fact that there must be this, at the very least, deistic God, and because of the statement in Exodus, seems very likely to have interacted with the Jewish people to some capacity, there's got to be some way to understand this apparent contradiction in order for what I know to be a fact of other cases to be true. And maybe that's a wrong way for me to approach it. But like I said, like if I was to come up to you and say, hey, Kevin, I think I found a contradiction with the laws of physics, you'd be like, yeah, keep drinking that Kool-Aid. Or pass me what you're smoking.
Yeah. So I'm with you to an extent. Like, so
yeah,
if you wanted to say that, and then you just want to be like, yeah, Kevin, Genesis is clearly wrong. And when it says that Adam heard God and God was walking, like that's Kevin, that's clearly false. Genesis is wrong. Great. I'm kind of on board. Right. But I think that my problem comes in where people negotiate with the text to such an extent where they make, like to me, it just seems abundantly obvious that multiple authors of multiple Old Testament texts did not view God as the God of the philosophers, the God whose existence,
And I am with you 100% on that. Like and that's why and that's part of my evidence, if that makes sense, is so this idea of the God of the philosophers was so foreign, would have been so alien to the Jewish people. And even more so when you take into the fact that they isolated themselves from anything that wasn't them. How could this idea have naturally originated within them? Now, as time has gone on, Moses Maimonides did reason out to, the God of the philosopher, so to speak. But the way that, like, to use a completely separate issue, is people say, oh, the Jewish people worship this war thunder god that eventually evolved into Yahweh. Hey, maybe that's historically how it happened, but that doesn't have an issue to me, Judaism or Christianity in large, because the way that cultures worked in that time was you had a pantheon of gods, but each family had their patron deity. What if Abraham's patron deity was that war thunder god? All right. And there is a Jewish tradition, and I can get into it a little bit deeper because it's actually kind of fascinating if you want to. But the Jewish tradition is at some point, Abraham reasoned that there could only be one God due to an observation he had made about the stars. And God revealed himself like in the same way that Paul would later on do with the Greeks, like, hey, y'all worship all these gods and you even have this altar to an unknown God. Let me tell you about the God you're worshiping without realizing it. and God revealed himself under the appearance of this thunder god. And it's like, hey, you reason that there is one God? Guess what? It's me. And then from there, helped open their mind further. So even if the original author of Exodus didn't have this idea of the philosopher God or the existence qua existence being, I would say that gives stronger evidence of my position.
Yeah, so I guess I have a little bit of a concern here in as much as I get the idea of, hey, that that was an old idea that was wrong, and now we have this new idea, and this idea is probably better.
Yeah.
Cool, I'm with you. But I guess my concern is when we try to retrofit the new onto the old. Like it seems to me like this idea of God, nobody can hear God, right? Well, according to Genesis, you totally can, right?
So,
And the reason I'm making this point is because when we are trying to figure out, so we've gotten to the point of theism, and now we're trying to figure out which one. Yahweh to me almost seems like a non-starter, right? Because Yahweh just doesn't fit this God that Aristotle came up with, right? You said something to the effect of like, well, look, the Christians got here eventually, right? And my point is kind of like, well, yeah, because the pagans got them there first, right? I mean, it's funny. I almost think of modern Christianity as being a Greek thing. It's like not Jewish, it's Greek.
So the reason why I say that is because the text, like regardless of when you decide on where it was written, whether it was written during the Babylonian exile, whether it was written by Moses, like no matter when it was written, the latest possible date it could have been written based on historical records still predates Aristotle by several hundred years. And Aristotle was the first one to kind of come up with this nebulous thought thinking itself, which is kind of like the foundational approach to getting to eventually the existence qua existence. And then Moses Maimonides predates the Islamic philosophers by maybe a century or two. And my years might be up, but I know that he predated the Islamic philosophers who predated Aquinas. But the as far as like the retroactively aspect, as far as like especially Genesis, is as far as whether the authors intended it to be literal or not, you have to understand that when it was written, history was not written the way that we write history today. The Iliad, the story of the fall of Troy, is a historical book for Homer. Is it a play and everything else? Yes, absolutely. Or not a play, a poem. Yes, absolutely. But that's how history was told. You didn't tell history by facts, numbers, and figures. You told it through poetry, through symbolism. And Genesis is being told in that same language. So again, it goes back to that question of the fact that the Bible uses the language of appearance. So when the authors were writing Genesis in that creation account, it wasn't with the idea of like, oh yeah, everyone's going to read it literally. That's why you have individuals living 900 years, because it was meant to reference something bigger than that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I do want to push back, I think, a little bit on the idea that all ancient history was told through like poetry and stuff like that.
I'm talking about like pre-Greco civilization, like really, 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 really old. Like 2000 BC old.
So what? Oh, to that. Well, I mean, we don't have anything from 2000 BC, right?
Well, that's when. Let's see. Um, what's the name? The Epic of Gilgamesh. Um, I think it's like rivals the Old Testament as far as like how old manuscripts of it are. But like that is also attempting to describe historical events through metaphorical language. Like I said, the Iliad is describing a historical event through metaphorical language. Heck, even Tacitus, when he's writing the annals of Roman history, he still refers to a mythical event of the Romulus and Remus, I think is the name of the brother, but
Romulus
being
Remus,
being raised by wolves and building the because that's the only historical account they had of that moment, and it's being told through this mythological poetic language. And if you've read Tacitus, he hates hearsay. He wants facts, but even he used this mythological approach because he understood that the audience understood it to not be factual like the rest of the stuff that he would be going over. So Genesis, especially because of when it was written, is written in that same style.
Okay, so I definitely don't disagree that the style of Genesis is poetic. Like even in modern Bibles, when you read the account of like when Yahweh is cursing the serpent to crawl on his belly and eat the dust and stuff, even they make that part in particular look all poetry like, where it's like, stanza lines and all that. However, I don't think it's the case that all of history was always told like that. And I couldn't remember, so I did a little bit of Googling off the side, but the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, he's the one who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War.
And that is one of my favorite examples. You know why?
Why?
He references Poseidon destroying the ships of the Persian king.
No, well, so I think that was... I don't think that was Thucydides. I think that was Herodotus, right?
Maybe.
Herodotus...
I just know that like the very first account
I could be
that we
wrong.
have of whoever the earliest account was, I know references Poseidon as being the reason why the Persian army lost their ships.
So that wouldn't have been... I'm pretty... And don't take my word as gospel, but that wouldn't have been Thucydides because he was writing about the Peloponnesian War. I think that would be Herodotus because Herodotus was writing about the Greco-Persian Wars. Herodotus is known as the father of history and stuff like that. But what's funny is, so Herodotus was the 5th century BC, and and so was Thucydides. So Thucydides was only 25 years younger than Herodotus. And Thucydides had some nasty things to say about Herodotus, saying that Herodotus included legends and fanciful accounts in his histories. And I actually think that the Peloponnesian War is actually pretty like bland, like it's kind of just like a recounting of events. So I do think that even in the 5th century BC, which is roughly when Genesis was being compiled, right? 5th century ish.
When did the Babylonian exile take place? Because
probably never, right? I mean, that's kind of the going historical model.
But it's been a while since I've looked at the exact dates, but like 5th century would have been about 400 BC. Let me see. But again, neither here nor there. But like it would have been compiled when that's like, even at the like I said, at the absolute latest, even if it was dying out, that was still popular. What I do want to do though is touch on a little bit on Gandalf the Greatest Wizard's question on why the texts of other religions, as far as like Atenus the Sun or the Zoroastrianism religion, is how come I'm not using the language of allegorical and everything else like that for those religious texts. And it has to go back to the use of the name that I was talking about. The name revealed the essence of it. And 10 is revealing itself as the essence of the sun. Like, it is the sun. It wasn't being allegorical. And even in Zoroastrianism, they are very definitive. Like, no, the essence, what is? No, we are being as clear as we possibly can be. Goodness and existence. You don't have that in Exodus. Or, I'm sorry, you don't have that in Genesis when you're talking about, like, hey, God's walking. Him walking isn't a descriptor of his essence. You can argue about it being an indicator of a trait he has.
It's incompatible with his essence being existence, though.
Yes. Yes, him having physical traits is incompatible with the essence. Yes, absolutely. But that's why you go and look at the essence. Like, what did these individuals believe their God was? And so the reason why is because the allegorical language is being used about traits, not about essence. It's about appearances. The literal language is being used for the essence, the identifying, like, no, this is what we're talking about. And when a 10 is being identified, it's not, like, you could argue, like, there's a language in there, like, hey, the rays of the sun hand out, it's using physical handing out, and like even the paintings depict the hands at the end of the rays of a 10 of the sun. Yes, I'm willing to argue that they understood that as metaphorical, but the fact of the matter is that they still believed it to be the physical sun. That's the difference, and why. Like, I'm applying the same reasoning throughout. Whatever they declare the essence to be, I'm taking that to be literal. And whenever they want to take something and describe it in a way that doesn't fit with that essence, that's allegorical.
If I may, and I don't want to speak for Mithrandir here, but I think that his point is something like this. So, sure, the ancient Egyptians thought that he was literally the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Ancient Jews thought that God literally walked in the garden.
Yeah.
They also thought that God could hear things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the Tower of Babel, the story is kind of framed as like humans were being too noisy and the gods couldn't sleep. It's kind of funny.
Yeah.
But so why should we care what ancient Egyptians thought if we also don't care what ancient Jews thought? You know what I mean?
So I would argue against the idea that the Jews believed it. Ancient Jews believed it literally. And the reason for that is when you start looking at some of the earliest commentaries that we have on Genesis, which admittedly is
post-Christian. The earliest commentary. Yeah.
Admittedly, it's post-Christian.
It's like 1,000 years after the books were written, right?
Yes, absolutely. But when you look at the Jewish tradition and the Jewish culture, they were very rigid. Very little deviation. Now, you did have like different schools, but you didn't have a whole lot of deviation from their tradition. And the very first Christians were Jews, and they came from that tradition. And one of the things that you see time and time again from these authors who were writing about the Old Testament and were talking about Genesis, they are talking about it as if it's obvious that it's a figurative account. And so much so that Origen, one of the only people that's a church father but not a saint, even goes so far as to say it is ridiculous to think that there was light without sun. So, it's figurative.
So while I agree with you that like it's obviously not real history, it seems to be the case that the vast majority of people living prior to the frankly, the Industrial Revolution, thought of Genesis as real history. I mean, it certainly seems like ancient Jews did. I mean, even just consider the author of the Gospel of Luke, right?
Do
Who
you?
has a genealogy of Jesus that
Yeah.
stretches all the way back to Adam.
So that gets into whether Genesis. So that gets into the question of Adam and Eve existing, and versus Genesis being literal. So
It seems hard for me to imagine that the author of the Gospel of Luke had this Adam that Jesus was descended from, but it's not the Adam of the story of Genesis. It's just
so let me ask
you know what I
this.
mean?
Do you think so the and this gets into like the question of divine, of divine inspiration, when the purpose of the purpose that I was getting at in this conversation is, okay, well, basically, let me figure out where my rock is, and then from there I can try to figure out the things that don't quite make sense. So the question of whether Adam and Eve being literal or real or historical or anything else is kind of like a side concern for the investigation. It's like, what does it matter if they were real or not if the Jews didn't have this real experience with the divine? Okay, so they had this experience with the divine. Was this real? I don't know, but we at least know that they had an experience with the divine at this point. Anything before that, and then continue on from there. And so, like, at this point in the conversation for the paper, I haven't even accepted the Bible as being divinely inspired. It's just, okay, so this is an account, and the Jewish people have claimed at this point in this work of having an experience with the divine, and this is what they claim the divine revealed itself to be. Does this make historical sense for it to be within the time period that this claim was made? It doesn't make sense for them to do it through a human being. So it seems reasonable to accept that it was a divine thing. And like I said, this is where it gets into like where it's not as solidly defined as it was in the first part. It's just like, well, it seems reasonable to accept that.
And sorry, what does it seem reasonable to accept? That just some ancient people had some kind of experience that they thought was divine?
That was divine, that revealed itself as what we nowadays call the philosopher God. And it was just, and it doesn't make sense for them at this point in time to have been able to reason to that. So either these people were far more advanced than we give them credit for, than any historical account would ever imagine, or the divine that we reason to does exist did reveal itself to them.
So I guess my whole point with this whole section was that whatever kind of God is being described in those ancient texts is simply not the God of the philosophers. So I don't think that God did reveal itself to the authors of those ancient texts. Does that make sense? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So and this might be the point of contention. I'm only looking at, what did they say this God was? I don't care if their text makes sense whatsoever at this point. I don't care if they said that this God is existence, like I am who I am.
They didn't say that, right? They said that God said, I am who am.
And, well, if you look into the understand, like, do you know why they don't write the vowels in
the Tetragrammaton?
In the Yahweh?
I forget why.
Because when you just say the vowels, it's
like breath or something, and breath is life and stuff.
Yes. So it's to imitate or point towards God being life. What is life but being?
Well,
but existence, the ultimate form of existence.
A rock has being without having life, right?
Well, that's what I was getting. Is like, it's the ultimate form of it. Like, you have existing. A greater form of that is life.
Well, wouldn't we say that God is like the ultimate form of being?
Yes.
And God
Yes.
isn't alive by like, God
Yeah.
God doesn't metabolize. Well, God doesn't change
Yeah.
at all, right? So he doesn't
Yes.
metabolize.
Yeah.
So like God's
And
not.
that's what I'm getting at is like you have the very base form of being, of existence, something inanimate, moving to something animated, and then God's even above that. He is the ultimate form of being, the ultimate form of existing, the ultimate form of life. It's so I would argue that they, even if they couldn't fully elaborate or explain it, going back to that whole Lovecraftian thing of like, hey, we just had this experience that just is. We don't know how to put it into words just yet because the words to describe it haven't been invented yet.
Sure, but I guess to go back to Will or Gandalf's point or something,
Mhm.
if we're willing to kind of give this much grace to texts like Genesis and Exodus and such,
So
why are we not willing to do this?
So that's my thing. I'm not giving that grace at all to Genesis at this point in the conversation.
Okay.
Like I haven't said, yeah, Genesis is divinely inspired. I haven't said
no.
And so it could be the case that like Genesis is just a fiction at this point in the conversation, a fictional work that's trying to talk about this being but getting it completely wrong. But what I have accepted is there, according to Exodus, there was a historical encounter where they talk about what was revealed to them, and it's something that doesn't make sense for them to have reason to within the time. Any other book that tries to talk about that, like I haven't accepted yet.
Yeah.
Like it could be just as wrong as anything else. Like all I've accepted at this point is there was an encounter with the divine that revealed itself as being. Genesis could be hogwash for all I care at this point in the conversation.
Yeah, so I guess I'm not even willing to. So, like, I guess part of what I mean by extending grace is you said something to the effect of, like, the author of Exodus wrote something that there's no way that he could have reasoned to when he wrote that God said that I am who am.
If I did say there was no way, that was a misspeak on my part.
And I totally may have misheard too. So
yeah.
Don't let me put words in your mouth.
The way that I understand it is, regardless of whether Exodus was written 1000 BC or 500 BC, I forget what the actual year, but I do remember
something in between those two, or something.
Yeah, I do remember that the absolute latest that it historically could have been written still predates Plato by several hundred years, and the idea of the philosopher God got its origin not with Plato but with Aristotle. And it wasn't formalized and finalized until Moses Maimonides, who is Jewish. And he is after Christianity has been formed. So because you had this idea that, to me, like, I'm trying to think, like, so negative numbers didn't exist until I want to say like the Renaissance. Like the idea of negative numbers didn't exist. Kevin, what would you do if you came across a piece of paper that through all possible dating showed that it came from Moses's cousin back in, 1500 BC, and it had negative numbers on there? You'd be like, how on earth did this come to be? Like, it doesn't make sense for the knowledge that was available at the time. Maybe he just was a one-off, though, that came to this conclusion and it was just lost to obscurity. So could it be the case that the Jewish people were a one-off obscurity, like weird thing? Yeah. It doesn't seem likely to me, but that's still a possibility.
This is part of what I mean when I say extending grace.
Mhm.
I think that you are imbuing a lot of Maimonides into Exodus. Does that make sense? So, like Exodus does not say anything about Exodus doesn't say anything about the god of the philosophers.
Right.
In fact, Exodus is really the opposite. We have this god that is appearing to the people as
Mhm.
a pillar of clouds and as a pillar of fire,
Yeah.
and is talking to people, like
Mhm.
directly speaking to people. This god gets angry. This god
Mhm.
kills people.
Yeah.
And then this god has this one-off line of "I am who am,"
Mhm.
and I think it's like a case of ignoring the misses and counting the hits to then go like, this is the philosopher god. Read the whole story. This
Yeah.
seems, it really seems like it's not the philosopher's
So
god to me, you know?
so that's where I'm getting into it though, is because I know people will argue against the historical contents of Exodus, as in like, well, did the Exodus actually happen? Were the Jews actually in Egypt? That's irrelevant. What matters to me is that this line of "I am who am" is in there. Why is that line in there? Because that is like, it's like, okay, to again use the math as the example, Kevin. Like, you come across and you see this guy and he's just got a bunch of like random things, and he's talking about shapes that don't make sense in Euclidean or non-Euclidean geometry. Like, you're like, boy, this guy seems to be all over the place. And then all of a sudden you see, and he talks about negative numbers. And you look at that and you see how, even if it was flawed, he somehow got to negative numbers, and then from that was able to get to even further truths. From a flawed reasoning getting to negative numbers to a further truth. Could that have happened where the ancient Israelites just kind of did a throwaway line of that and just happened to get it right? Maybe.
I guess
Maybe.
my point though is that the ancient Israelites, the you know, the author of Exodus, the
Mhm.
authors, they didn't get to further truths, right? They wrote this story about
Mhm.
this very not philosopher's god style
Yeah.
god, and then 1,000 years later, or when did Maimonides live? He
It was
he
like
5th century or something?
fifth, sixth century. But the reason why I say this is because you even have this idea of like
Oh,
Maimonides
13th
formal
century. 13th century was
13.
Maimonides.
Okay.
So that means that it took 2,000 years or something like
Yeah.
that to get
So
from.
Maimonides, yes, Maimonides is the one that formalized it. Like, remember how I was talking about like, hey, we had this experience and we can't even use the words to is
I think you're reading the same comment that I
yeah.
am. This is very. I
Um,
haven't heard this
yeah.
before. That's very interesting.
But the what's the word I'm looking at? Like for the Lovecraftian experience where you they didn't have a word to describe the experience until Maimonides finally came around and was able to formalize that experience. So it could be a case that like I'm reading backwards into it due to bias, and maybe. But we just agreed that there is, or I shouldn't say we. I've concluded to a point where I am confident in saying it's impossible for it to not be the case, that there has to be existence qua existence.
I'm so sorry. Wait, say that one more time. I'm so
Yes.
sorry. My brain just
So-
wasn't following.
So I have gotten to so at this point, I have concluded to the point where it is impossible for it to not to be the case.
There
Or
must be.
it must be the case that there is existence qua existence that is the source of all that exists. Okay? So I've concluded that point. All right? So because I know that this being must exist, and there is this people that claims to have an encounter with this being 3,500 years before anyone could formalize that in a proper way, And is it a proper explanation of that experience? No, but is it close for what that time period could describe it in? Let me put it this way. It is a time-accurate descriptor of the philosopher God. Is it the philosopher God as we would nowadays understand it? No. In much the same way that the philosophers that predated Plato would talk about atoms, it's not the same way that a scientist of modern times would talk about the atom, but they were talking about atoms. It's kind of the same thing. They were trying to explain the philosopher God in their very limited vocabulary.
Yeah, I may have just identified like a disconnect, and it's worth. I think it's worth me just pointing this out. And then, if you want to dwell here, great, and if you don't, so I had kind of thought that you and I were pretty much agreed on phase one. Like, hey, there's but now I don't think that we are entirely agreed, and here's why. So, I said something to the effect of like, I'm happy with the idea that there has to be like a start of everything. And if we're going to call that like a thing that has existence qua existence, I'm cool with that. Now, that's not the language that I would use. I would just say I'm cool with the idea that there exists, that I'm cool with the idea that there is something that necessarily exists.
Exists, yes.
I'm actually on board. And I'm not saying that like I could be on board. I am on board with that. And then I was going into phase two. And I think that either right at the end of phase one or at the beginning of phase two, you have this word being, where there's a being that is existing. So I actually don't get that far, right? So I get to the point where I'm like, yeah, I think that something must exist necessarily. And as far as I'm concerned, I just think that the universe could exist necessarily. And if you ask like, well, how is that even possible? My response there is kind of like, well, first of all, I don't know. But second of all, I think it's kind of the same thing as like, how does God exist necessarily? Well, it's a brute fact that God exists. I don't know. Maybe the universe existing is a brute fact. And therefore,
and that gets into, and if I can recommend one book to anyone that wants research on this subject, please read it, because it's free and it's 20 pages long, and a lot of them are half of the pages are just full of reference notes. And it's linked in there, but it's the Aquinas on Being in Essence. And that's where he walks through, if I can humble brag here for a moment, like I, in my 19, early 20-year-old brain, formulated a very poor, but basically this argument for myself. Obviously, though, Aquinas does a much better job than I could on actually like breaking it down, but he does a phenomenal job of like, if you take everything else from my argument up to that point, and then you read the On Being in Essence, you'll see why it can't be the universe. It can't be, why the brute force fact has to be existence qua existence. So that's, due to it being the way that my post is written, it did make it hard for us to go through it on here, but that's where I'm arriving at that conclusion, and why it's like, no, it can't be the case that there isn't existence qua existence.
Sure, and I guess my point is that the universe could be existence qua existence.
No, because if you and I are a part of the universe, that's the problem. Part. Existence qua existence means just existence, no parts, nothing else. And I even touch it in the post, so I didn't touch it here, the dogma of divine simplicity, where everything that we talk about, like, oh, God has omniscience or God has knowledge. No. God appears to us to have knowledge, but he doesn't actually, because he's only existence. His knowledge is the same as his existence. His power is the same as his existence. Like, God is only existence. He has no parts. The universe has parts. Therefore, it can't be existence qua existence, because that contradicts what it means to be existence qua existence.
Yeah. And I wrote down mereological nihilism in my notes up top, because when I say something like the universe, really all that I'm saying is the collection of all this stuff. So when I'm saying that I think that the universe is existence coexistence, pretty much what I'm saying is I think that each of the, and then insert the meteorological symbols here, has existence coexistence, right? So if you think that they are quarks, then great. I think that all of the quarks have existence coexistence. Or if you think
Mhm.
that they are fields, then great. I think
Yeah.
that all of the quantum fields that excite into quarks and such,
Mhm.
I think that all of those are existence coexistence.
That gets into my critique of the critique of Anselm's ontological argument. By the way, one of my favorite things was like of the Islamic philosophers is someone did just as a fun aside, Averroes wrote a book on the philosophies. Avicenna, and then Al Ghazali wrote something called a critique of the philosophies, and then Averroes followed it up with a critique of the critiques of the philosophies.
Love it.
But when Anselm wrote it, and I can send you a link for you to attach in the descriptor, I did a comment that breaks down why the critique of like, well, if God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, why is it that I can think of a horse of which no horse greater than that can exist or can be conceived? Why doesn't that exist? It's because you're taking what for God is his essence, what he is, and putting it as an accidental attribute on something that doesn't have to be.
Did we agree earlier that essences don't really exist though? They're just definitions?
Yeah, but that's what I'm getting at is like, in order for God to be God, or in order for existence to be existence, it's got to be existence. If you take existence away, it's not existence anymore. So like if I was to take whatever makes Kevin human, whatever that part of that DNA genome is, you're not human anymore. So if you basically what it is like, okay, so Kevin has DNA, so therefore he is a human being. And I say, okay, well, banana has DNA, therefore it must be human being. Well, no, even though it's got a lot of similarities, it's not a human being.
Like 97% of our DNA or something is the same.
Yeah, I remember bananas
something
having
crazy,
a ridiculous, yeah. But it's at 3%. But so like you said, it's a quark plus existence. So it's not existence coexistence then, because you just added something to it. Existence coexists. So while you are correct that a quark has existence coexistence, if we're being extremely pedantic, we're not talking about existence coexistence plus something else. We're talking about existence coexistence, period.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't understand why the universe couldn't be the thing that exists qua existence, right? Like that exists brutally.
Yeah. Well, no. So, and I think that might be the disconnect as well. Existence qua existence isn't brutally. It's not where. How do I like the? If you look at mathematics, which is about one of the only other places that I can think of where we've like demonstrated brute facts to exist. How come a point is undefined? It's because it's so simple it can't be broken down, so it's brute. It's not divisible. It can't be broken apart. When you look at the undefined terms of mathematics, those are all brute facts because they can't be broken apart. They can't be broken down. And definition is when you take something and break it apart into its smaller parts. So by the very fact that we can break apart the universe means it's not simple, means it's not.
You can't break apart the universe.
Well, no. So a circle is it's an infinite line, right? Going around and around and around and around. But I can cut it in half. Even now, does it stop being a circle then? Yes, but it's still divisible.
I mean, it's not a circle anymore. And I feel like the universe is the same way. Like, if we were going to talk about the universe except without, this candle, well, then that's not the universe anymore. That's the universe minus a candle. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. that means it's not simple. In order for something to be simple, you can't even draw a line and say this is different from this section. Like, can you divide a point? A mathematical point. Can you divide that? Well, no, because it just is. It's so infinitesimally small mathematically. There is no more breaking it down. Like it's impossible to break it down. That's what the simple being is. It's impossible to break it down any further because we've gotten to the basic of all basics of all basics, the brute force fact. So for the universe to be the brute force fact, that would mean that it's impossible for us to divide it. But the very fact that I can point and say this, where I am, is different from where Kevin is, that means it is
I'm losing you a little bit.
Visible, even abstractly, but you can't do that. I think I'm back.
I think you're back. So you were saying that we can, like, you were saying that we could point to one location and then a different location, and those are two different locations, and so the universe isn't simple. And here's where I'll actually disagree with you a little bit, is that you didn't point to the universe in either one of those. So that is not the universe, and this is not the universe. The universe actually can't be like divided at all. The universe is the sum total of everything that exists. So I don't think that you can get in a sense, right? You can't get more simple than all that is.
So in order for you to be correct, Kevin, you and I would need to be identical.
Neither you nor I are the universe.
Are we a part of the universe?
Sure, but we are not the universe.
If you are if I was to take, so your hand is a part of you, but it's not you, is basically the argument you're getting at, right?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. But I can still point to your hand as something distinct or something that's divisible from you. So if we are a part of the universe,
I don't think the universe is like that, I think is a key point. Like, so as in if you chopped off my hand, like then there would be Kevin and there would be like this decaying hand over there. But the universe isn't the same way. Like if you took something out of the universe, that's not the universe anymore.
You have the universe and the thing that you took out existing outside of space-time, and
yeah, I mean the universe is all that exists. So I think that trying to talk about dividing all that exists, it's kind of like, well, you can't do that. Like,
well, so that's what I'm. So dividing doesn't, in the way that I'm talking about, doesn't have to be like an actual division, like where you're actually separating. So if it's as simple, it can be as simple as drawing an imaginary line. If like when we are asking if a person is symmetrical, you draw an imaginary line. So you are now dividing one half from another half, right? You are not physically tearing them apart, but you are now able to do that. You're able to do that conceptually, abstractly. For a real simple thing, for a real, like, can you do that abstractly for a point?
Can I divide a point? Like
abstractly?
No.
Mathematically, yeah.
No, yeah.
We can abstractly divide the universe, even if it's just as simple as like this. This is a part of the universe, but it is not the universe. That's still an abstracted division, even if we're not physically removing or dividing it. Therefore, it's not simple. If something is truly simple, you can't even do it abstractly.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I might kind of like pivot just a little bit here, and say, let's say, like let's kind of, I guess we can kind of if you wanted to add anything else about the whole universe thing,
Mhm.
I'd be happy to let you do that. But I'll tell you where I'm pivoting to, and that
Yep.
is, let's say that you're right about like how it's not, like, the universe can't be great. I think it might make sense then to talk about the Christian God a little bit more here,
Mhm.
because of things like the incarnation.
Mhm.
But I'll let you, if you think that there's anything else to say
I'm
about.
seeing the chat. I think I know where you're going.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that it's interesting to talk about how, the God of the philosophers can't be subdivided or anything like that.
Mhm.
Um, but then we have the Trinity, right? And we
Yeah.
have the incarnation, and it's like,
Yep.
well, that seems to be a disqualifier then.
Yeah. So the answer to both questions is similar, um, but distinct enough. So for the incarnation, the understanding is that the divine essence is still indivisible. It's still what it is.
Again,
Is
essences are just definitions; so they don't
Yeah,
actually exist.
yeah. But if you were to ask Jesus, "Who are you?" He would say, "I am Jesus, son of Joseph." If you ask him, "What are you?" I am. He would give the definition answer of divine, the divine essence, and the definition of human. So the idea is that they are both really present in him, but they don't intermingle. They don't change. The divine is still indivisible, and there's the human essence in the one person. The Trinity is almost the reverse, where you still have the divine, indivisible essence. Where if I was to point at the essence, I couldn't say this is different from that and whatnot. But that one essence that's
Which
indivisible
is
is
just a
possessed.
definition.
Yeah.
To make things easier, can I ask you to
Mhm.
say definition instead of essence?
Sure. So so I'm gonna do this to make I'm gonna make this one clarification. Because if I was to say what are you, Kevin, and you say human, and I was to and then ask, well, I'm human too. That doesn't mean that we have the same particular definition.
Because we are two different humans.
Correct. You, as my philosopher teacher would say, Kevin's blood, guts, and bones is different from my blood, guts, and bones, but it's still the same definition for it. In God, you don't have that particular definition difference. If I was to say, God or the Father, what are you? He would give me an answer. And if I was to ask the Son, what are you? Not only would he give me the same answer, he would point to the exact same thing, the same, metaphorical blood, gut, and bones that the Father pointed at. To touch a little bit into Trinity heresy, it would be like, James, what are you? And I point to my blood, gut, and bones, and then my significant other comes up to me and says, "What are you?" And I point to the same blood, gut, and bones. Like I said, that is a heretical analogy. It is not what the church teaches as far as like the Trinity goes, but that's the understanding of the dogma of the Trinity and the Incarnation. That it's still, yes, the indivisible existence qua existence, but the particular existence qua existence for the Father is the same particular existence qua existence for the Son, for this is the same for the Holy Spirit. And then that existence qua existence is incarnated in the person of Jesus Christ and is not intertwined, intermingled, or mixed in any way with the human. Can I fully explain it beyond that? No, that's about the limit of my ability to explain it, which, and maybe it's a cop out, but it again, it touches into the Lovecraftian, like human language can only get so far when trying to explain that which is beyond our experience.
Yeah. Maybe a couple of quick points here. And that is, so I think unless somebody wants to commit to the heretical view that like God the Father is identical with like God the Son is identical with God the Holy Ghost,
Yeah.
right? And that's a heresy, right? Because then all of a sudden like God the Holy Ghost incarnated and God the Father
Yeah.
also and like you can't say that, right? So
Yeah.
unless you want to say that, then it certainly seems like then Jesus is not identical with God the Father, who is not identical with the Holy Ghost.
Mhm.
And if that's the case, then it seems to me like we have this not perfectly simple being. And
So, and I know Aquinas touches on it, but it's been a very long time since I've read that. And that kind of goes into, again, beyond the scope of the conversation, as we kind of touched on with like the Genesis. Like I said, the whole purpose of this was like, let me get like the whole purpose of Descartes, like cogito ergo sum, was like, let me get to a grounding point as fast as I possibly can.
yeah,
This is kind of the same thing. Let me get to a grounding point, and then from that grounding point, I can then try to understand Genesis. From that grounding point, I can then try to understand
yes,
the Trinity.
no. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
Except that I think that like we look at this grounding point and we can almost immediately just cross off the Christian God and be like, no, that's not right. Maybe the
Yeah.
Muslims got it right, like
Yeah.
or maybe Jews have been right this whole time, but it
Yeah.
looks like the Christian God kind of it seems clearly to me to be like not compatible with the God of the philosophers,
Yeah. So that gets into the question of the apostles, and
Yes.
the liar, the Lord, liar, lunatic question. So, and that's what I was getting is like, okay, so basically, so to walk through the thought process in extremely simple terms, I started with, okay, is there or isn't there a God? Okay, well, there's got to at least be something that's the source of everything. Okay, so there's at least one God. Well, what does it mean for this to be a God? Existence, coexistence. Can there be more than one existence, coexistence? Well, no, because if it's indistinguishable from another existence, coexistence, they're actually one and the same. Was there a group that had an encounter with this existence, coexistence? It seems reasonable to believe that it's the Jews. That's where we were at until we jumped into the Trinity. So the next step then is like, okay, so at least the Jews seem to have it right. I did see someone at one point, and I will touch on it now, had asked, like, do I believe that Christianity is a continued evolution of Judaism? The actual terminology is fulfillment of Judaism, but in the layman's term, yes. It is the direct linear development of the Israelite religion. That's why you had the apostles go to the Jews first and even question, like, well, in Acts, it was like, wait a minute, do people need to become a Jew before they can become a baptized Christian? Like, that identity is so intertwined. But at this point in the conversation, before we jump to the Trinity, we were on, okay, so at least for me, the Jews got it right. But what about these other two that came after? What about Christianity, and what about Islam that came after Christianity? And then liar, lunatic,
yeah,
Lord argument. Well, it seems to be that the Christianity might be onto something here because of that. What about the Muslims? Well, they just outright deny a lot of even things that Judaism and Christianity hold as historical, and said, oh yeah, no, the Jews and Christians agree with us. And then you see that that's not the case. So there's a break at some point between Christianity and Islam. So let me stop before that break occurred.
Yeah. So I guess just a brief question about like before we even kind of jump into the trilemma, let's assume that it works. Like, let's just say that like the historical evidence is good enough that you think, or let's just say this, the historical evidence for Christianity is better than the historical evidence for Islam, than Hinduism, that whatever, it's just okay. So let's grant that. But then let's also remember that it seems, at least maybe let's grant me my premonitions about the dissimilarities between Yahweh and the God of the philosophers, around the Trinity and the God of the philosophers. What should somebody do with, okay, this religion has the strongest historical evidence, but when it comes to like the actual, it doesn't fit with the logic of what
Yeah.
this God is supposed to be.
Yeah.
So do you think that the historical evidence for Christianity is strong enough to overcome logical premonitions that somebody might have about how God is?
If someone is willing to accept something that even seems to contradict logical premonitions because of the laws of physics, and be like, well, according to the laws of physics, this must be the case. And then they follow the evidence to best understand. Like, we are looking for a cause within quantum entanglement. We know that there isn't an apparent cause because right now we have equated cause with being deterministic. And we have equated the speed of light to limiting the passing of information from cause to effect. But quantum entanglement seems to be doing something weird with cause and effect as Einstein understood it. But cause and effect is such an integral part to the way that reality itself works that we know that there is some relation of cause and effect even at the quantum level, even if it doesn't quite fit with our current understanding. But we know there's got to be something cause and effect adjacent. Let's use that word for right now. Like, it cause and effect adjacent. Even if we can't understand it, even if there seems to be this tension between quantum entanglement or quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity, we know there's got to be some way for them to be cohesive together, because reality seems to be pretty cohesive, and there's got to be that cohesiveness. So if we've gotten to this point where it's like, okay, it does seem to be historically that out of the religions out there, that Christianity seems, due to historical evidence, the one that's most like it, then this then gets into the question of, did Jesus really promise to protect his church from error or not? And that ultimately is where it comes down to. If you don't believe that, then you can be a follower of Jesus and not be a member of any institutionalized religion, because there was never any promise to protect it from error. But if there was a promise to protect it from error, and he really is the divine that has that ability to protect it from error, then I can rest assured that even if I don't fully understand, there must be a connector thing to the stuff that isn't quite making sense to me logically just yet.
Yeah, let me kind of play with your analogy a little bit, because I think I can even make it hopefully like a little bit easier, I hope. So instead of talking about anything quantum, how about we talk about general relativity, because that's like a little bit more, it's 100 years old. So, we've kind of gotten, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and stuff, Einstein is coming up with general relativity, and it's going to replace Newtonian mechanics. And like Newtonian mechanics is like pretty darn solid. Like it's good, man. It works. So if we are, and in this analogy, Newtonian mechanics is going to be the philosopher God, and general relativity is going to be the evidence of like, I guess, like for the Christian historicity evidence, kind of. So Einstein has to now look at his model and be like, well, shoot, if I'm right, then Newton was wrong. And that's like a big freaking deal, man. Like, that's like crazy. So let me make sure that all my ducks are in a row. Let me really check the empirical evidence. And I don't think it's until you have like overwhelming empirical evidence or whatever that you actually accept general relativity as true over the established model, right? And so,
Mhm.
in this analogy, I think that uh, general relativity is the evidence for kind of like Jesus and like the Christian historicity picture,
Yeah.
and Newtonian mechanics is kind of this model of the philosopher God. So
Yeah.
it seems like uh, Einstein looked at the model of the philosopher God and said that's actually kind of wrong, and this is correct.
Yeah.
Do you
Yes.
and so but the way that it turned out in history is that the empirical evidence for general relativity was there.
Yeah.
Einstein was right. And so
Yes.
do you view the evidence for um you know the gospel stories being accurate, that evidence is analogous to the evidence for general relativity, in as much as the evidence of the Christian story is so overwhelming that it's going to supersede this kind of theoretical model that we have in place for what God should be.
Yes. Because there's a reason I don't follow the philosopher God,
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Yeah.
Like, and again, like we still use a lot of Newtonian physics for like down to earth physics. Like, let's be like, we still use it.
Oh yeah,
Does
of
anyone
course.
bring?
You learn Newtonian physics in high school. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, and no one's going around trying to figure out, okay, well, what is the general relativity mechanics for the skateboard going down the hill? No, we use Newtonian
Right.
physics to to
Yeah.
figure that out.
Baby steps, you know.
So this isn't saying that the philosopher God is useless or 100% wrong. No, it gets a lot right. Like it does. So it's a useful thing, but it doesn't capture the full picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm glad that we were able to get to this point. And I think that the claim that you just made is really, I think it's quite a bold one, right? Like the evidence is so good that I'm willing to kind of throw out this theoretical model of the philosopher God, because yes, if I am going to accept the Christian picture, then it is a little bit different. The old model might make you think that something like the Trinity is not possible, but the evidence, like the historical evidence for Christianity, is so good that I'm actually willing to say, like, no, man, it's got to be the Trinity because that's how overpowering the evidence is.
Yeah.
So, and probably unsurprisingly, I don't think that the evidence is that good.
Yeah. And that's what I was getting at is like, that's why it's almost divided into two parts.
Mm-hmm.
Because like you said, yeah, no, James, I'm willing to give you the first part. Like we're like, even if we're not in 100% agreement, we're in agreement enough. The second part is where it gets tricky because of how old the historical evidence is, because of like, you have people debating about the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of 300. Like, yeah, 300 Spartans were there, but were they backed up for the backed up? Like, and we also know that there were other soldiers there as well, but were they there for the entire thing? Did they run away before the last stand, or were they even there at the last stand? And 300 just sounds more epic. Like, there's debates on like the finer details on that. And that's just the nature of historical evidence. So, and that's also why I started off with this saying, like, hey, this is like my walkthrough. And I think something to really understand and to keep in mind is something that like two quotes that have stuck with me for years. The first one is by Thomas Aquinas. For one without faith, no explanation is sufficient. For one with faith, no explanation is required. Now, obviously, this isn't Aquinas saying, hey, just throw your hands up. Don't even bother trying to explain it. Like, dude tried to explain as much as he possibly could. But what it gets down to is what is, like, if one doesn't have faith, of course, the explanation of, no, the Jews just happened to randomly get something right about the philosopher God barely, is going to be more reasonable than, no, they had a divine encounter. because even though it's the same evidence, like we're both looking at, like they believed this aspect of the divine, but what's the conclusion being drawn from that same piece of evidence? It's going to depend on that aspect. The second thing, which I think is going to be even more compelling and more mind opening, was said by Sir Peter Brian Medawar, who is the reason why we're able to do these skin grafts and like reattach ears to people.
Well, Jesus did that way before this. Whoever, so you know, this guy.
But
sorry, bad joke.
No, you're fine. But one of the quotes that he said is, "The human mind responds to a new idea the way the human body responds to a new protein. It rejects it." And that's what I see a lot of times is, and maybe the only reason why I did come to the conclusion of Catholicism is because I had been exposed to the idea. Whereas for someone who hasn't been exposed to it, is going to reject my reasoning because it's a new line of reasoning and it's a new idea. That also might be why it was hard for me to move away from Catholicism, even with this journey, and maybe it was just a futile attempt. But that's why I started off as like, no, this is why I am Catholic, and I think it's a good reason why one should be Catholic. But is it going to convince someone that isn't Catholic to be Catholic? No. And that's not the purpose of this.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting kind of I almost said admission. That's not the right word, but it's an interesting point. And yeah, the paraphrase there from Aquinas, because I actually looked into this one time because I saw Bishop Strickland or something quote. He said, he like made that quote from. I'm like, there's no way that it's actually in the Summa, and it's a paraphrase. But,
yeah.
But yeah, you know, I do think that that's yeah, if we are kind of making the move to faith, then I think I am kind of happy to kind of rest my case there and say like, yeah, okay, that's fine. Faith is kind of, I guess, beyond the
human
the
experience
scope. Yeah, faith is just beyond the scope of what I can kind of like engage with. You know what I mean? Like, I can talk about the reliability of historical sources, and I can talk about various methods. Is analytical philosophy gonna wind up at more truths than like kind of the scholastic metaphysics? But then when it comes to faith, it's kind of like I can't really interact with that. I kind of just have to like give a little bit of a hat tip to it and say very well.
Yeah, and I hate to use refer to that and this is not me trying to be like a cop out. It's just me pointing out like maybe it's because of the fact that I have faith. You and I can look at and this happens all the time. You and I can look at the same piece of evidence and come to different conclusions. Even in science itself, that's why you have peer-tested reviews and everything else, because people can look at the as Neil deGrasse Tyson once said, my respect for him has gone up and up and up and up as time has gone on. But he once said the whole purpose of the scientific method is to do everything you can to remove the human experience from it. Because if there is any bit of human experience in it, and this is me adding on to it now, if there's any bit of the human experience in it, you're going to have as many different conclusions as there are humans looking at it. So that's why when we moved into that second part, I'm very fine saying, hey, based on the evidence, this is what seems reasonable to me. I understand you see it as differently, but that's where it gets into like, it's what does the evidence suggest to you?
Yeah. And to kind of reiterate, I guess, your point, and back up the point. So I don't think that the truth is ever really a cop out. You know what I mean? So if the truth is, that faith plays some kind of role, maybe even like an important role, then I don't think it's a cop out to
acknowledge it.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that acknowledging the truth is a cop out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, I just wanted to say that. I looked at the time and realized we've been talking for 2.5 hours.
2.5 hours, yeah.
There's one thing that I think is worth at least having you talk to for a little bit.
Okay.
I'll, in the interest of time, I probably won't say anything. But where was it? Here it is. The chat's been talking a little bit about this comment from Scoop Group. I'm once again troubled by the idea that if Christ is who he claims to be, then it necessitates the Roman Catholic Church And I did write down on my notes, I had to do the back of the page here, that you said something about the like, hey, if the church really isn't going to fail, then like, hey, which church has been around the longest, right? Like Catholic.
Yeah.
You didn't mention Orthodox and stuff, but who really cares? And I think that the Protestant view is just something along the lines of like, no, like this is all the church. Like, just as how Catholics wouldn't say that, like, no, only the priestly fraternity of St. Peter is the true church. No. All of the Catholic churches, including the Melkite Catholics, right? They're all
Yeah.
part of the church. I think that the Protestants have the same idea. They just extend it even beyond the city limits of Rome, as it were.
Yeah. So this is going to get a lot into like the apostolic succession and like a lot of the hierarchical structure of the church. So it does not necessitate the Roman Catholic Church, but which you kind of touched on. It does necessitate, I believe, the Catholic Church. And I did see someone like, well, why doesn't he talk about the Orthodox? Well, the Orthodox and Catholics believe the same thing, and that's the key part there. I know that, like, I spoke with someone who, let me see, all right, I think I'm back.
Yeah, I didn't lose your audio. I only lost, your camera got a little choppy, but that's it.
Oh, okay. I spoke with someone who has studied like the Orthodox and Catholic disagreement on the Filioque way. And at least from the Catholic perspective, and a lot of the Orthodox bishops are starting to agree with this as well, we're just saying the same thing in different ways. So we believe the same thing. We believe the same dogmatically revealed, preserved truths. You then get to Protestants, and there's rejections. The canon of the books was closed before the Protestant church existed, and they took some books out.
It wasn't closed until Trent, right? After the Protestant Reformation?
I think it was like closed like definitively, but like the books themselves were like selected before the Protestant church. Like these books are divinely inspired, and the closing was like, okay, yeah, no, we're just like, and as you and I have talked about before, whenever a council defines something, it's like, okay, so just because y'all idiots couldn't see that it was clear before, we're making it clear now. So when the Council of Trent closed the books, it doesn't, or closed the canon, it didn't mean that that's when it was created. It was like, okay, it was created back then, and just to make it clear, that's what it's supposed to be. But regardless, there's the denial of the real presence of the Eucharist. There's the dogma of double predestination from Calvin that rejects single predestination. Like there's so many rejections of church dogmas, even outside of the canon of the Bible. There's so many rejections of ideas that there isn't that unison. There isn't that unbroken line of church dogma. Like if you look at the Catholic Church, and I know people will argue, oh, well, this teaching changed or that or the other, but you can always see as the line progresses, not necessarily that it changed to contradict a previous teaching, but that it evolved to a deeper understanding. But within the Protestant faith, you have contradictory changes. I think one of the easiest examples is in the Catholic faith, you had annulments instead of divorces. Now you can get into like whether that's actually a divorce or not, but the understanding within the Catholic faith is like, no, we're just looking to see if the marriage actually took place or not. Because if it actually did, you can't divorce it. If it didn't, then there's no marriage to divorce. But then a lot of Protestant church were like, nah, you know what? We'll go ahead and allow divorces. And maybe I'm being a little uncharitable in the way that I'm describing it, but this is just to completely simplify it. Where they're looking at what a teaching used to be and saying, you know what? We're changing that. We're doing something completely different. And that is why, for me, it's like, well, you're breaking away from that line of teaching that you claim to be following. There is one church, though, that seems to be following that same line of teaching in an unbroken fashion, and that seems to be the Catholic Church. Whether, Eastern Orthodox, like, it seems to be the Catholic Church.
And again, I do want to wrap up soon-ish, but maybe I'll just kind of say one word in defense of my Protestant friends. Why couldn't a Protestant look at the Protestant disagreements in the same way that a Catholic might look at Catholic disagreements with past Catholic teachers? Here's an example: the death penalty, right? So past popes have said that there is nothing contradictory. The death penalty is totally fine, but the Catechism today says that it's intrinsic. What's the exact word? It's like an insult to the dignity of.
Inadmissible.
Yes, it's inadmissible, and it's an insult to the dignity of the human person, or something like that. And the insult to the dignity of the human person seems to be pretty at odds with past.
So, gosh, I wish I had it, but I left it in the car because I literally went out and I specifically got my girlfriend's going through OCIA. She actually finished her rite of acceptance today, so
cool.
First officially starting it. But so I keep it in my car because I go pick her up and take her to church. And I accidentally left it in the car, but I specifically went out and got it because it's like, no, I want you to have the most up-to-date version. And I've studied that over and over and over and over and over again. But it's an insult to the dignity of the human person, in as much as killing in self-defense is an insult to the dignity of the human person, because it is a removal of the human life. Does that mean that killing in self-defense is immoral? No. And what inadmissible means is it's not advisable. As in, not that it's immoral or not that it's against the law, but like, if you went to an expert that knew what they were doing, Kevin, and you needed to have some blood drawn, could they do it with leeches? Yeah.
They could.
Is that a good idea, or is that something that's medically advisable? No. But could it be done in a state of extreme emergency?
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Yeah. That's what the death penalty is. Even before the update happened, the definition was, hey, as Pope John Paul II put it, hey, the hope is eventually we get to a society where we don't need the death penalty. That's even before the change in the update. And all that this is saying, it's a lot more formalized, but all it's saying is like, hey, by the way, guys, you know that thing we've been hoping for? We're now there. So it hasn't changed what the death penalty is. It hasn't changed what is taught on the death penalty, because it's always taught, hey, the goal is for us to be in a situation, in a state of a society where we don't need to use it. And the church has now said, hey, we're now there. Versus divorce, where the teaching was, it's never acceptable. What God has bound together, man shall not undo. Well, what is divorce other than undoing what God has bound together?
The people clamor for more, James.
Well, I'm glad.
I am too. I think that we've had 3 now fantastic conversations and a ton of material to do a 4th and then a 5th and then a 6th. And then, but
you told me that Sundays aren't very responsive for streams.
I know. Look at this. The people are here and they're clamoring for more. So, all of that to say, we have a ton to talk about still.
Yes.
But it's 10:30 at night by me.
Yeah.
I'm getting really, really tired. I know that James is still ready to go. He could go for another 5 hours, but for me, it's about my bedtime. So, audience, we James and I can pick up exactly where we left off next time, but I do think it's gonna have to wait for next time because I'm really tired. But I would love James to kind of hand you the microphone for just final thoughts. If there was something that you wanted to kind of say you didn't get to, by all means, take this opportunity. If you want to just kind of summarize the main point, I guess, of the write-up that you presented at the beginning, by all means. But the floor is yours.
Yeah, like I said, the main point of the write-up is it was really a thought exercise for me. It was just a fun little thought exercise for me, and I figured, you know what? If there are people out there that can benefit from this, let me share it. And it's been a work in progress, and it's been present online in some form for almost 15 years now, I want to say. I think the first time I posted something similar to this was on a small little meme platform called iFunny.
I remember iFunny.
Yes. I was a huge part of the iChristian group there. But it's always been just it's been a thought experiment for me. It's like, hey, is this something that I can logically reason myself to? And part of the reason why I have it out there is to counter the claim that being religious is irrational. And you and I talked about this briefly off stream, and I do want to share it and put this out there, is that there is a difference between someone being right and something being rational. One of the aspects of logic is something can be rational and wrong, and something can be irrational and correct. So even if I'm wrong, I wanted people to understand that just because someone is religious doesn't make them an idiot, ignorant, or irrational. That there is a lot of logic and reasoning behind this position, and that someone can have a rational reason for it. Like I was saying, it took an expert on medieval philosophical thought 20 pages to break down Aquinas's first 2 paragraphs. And that pattern basically repeats throughout the entire book. So just like how we don't completely dismiss Newton because he's wrong, he still has a lot of useful things to contribute to the scientific community. Just because a philosopher or ancient thinker had something wrong doesn't mean he has nothing to contribute. There are a lot of thinkers that I disagree with. Descartes, Nietzsche, Hume, Kant, but they all have something to contribute, and they have an importance to the way that we think nowadays. So when you see someone online that is referring to these ancient thinkers, and just because they got 1 or 2 things wrong doesn't mean that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Actually look into it, open yourself up, and recognize that your mind's going to reject new ideas. You got to fight that.
I couldn't agree more. Ray says that there are plenty of dumb atheists and dumb religious people, and plenty of genius atheists and genius religious people. That is so very true.
Yes.
I personally care a lot more about having talks with rational people rather than having talks with right people, because I just don't find it all that interesting if I only talk with people who agree with me, I guess. And also conversations with very rational people who disagree with you are some of the best conversations that you can possibly have. And that's selfishly why I love talking to James, because we disagree on plenty of things, but I think that James is a very rational person. Hopefully I'm mostly rational myself, at least most of the time.
You are.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, these are some of my favorite conversations. So I totally agree with everything that you said there. And thank you for being my rational conversation partner today. I really appreciate you being on the show again.
Yes. Can't wait for next time.
Me too. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been an absolute blast. James, I can't wait to have you back again sometime soon. And until next time.
Till next time.